Hello, it's really great to have two new guests join us today, Jake Hirsch-Allen and Nick Vincent, and to get together with Renee Black, who will be joining me as a host today. And usually we start off by asking an introductory question because we're always interested in learning why people are doing what they're doing now. So maybe I'll ask you, Jake, first, but equally to you, Nick, about your personal journey. Why are you doing the work that you're doing now? And then we can get into it a little bit more deep afterwards.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for asking the personal sort of question. In this case, is perhaps more relevant than usual because what we're talking about today, public AI, at least in my case, is something that I'm doing pro bono currently out of an altruistic interest in changing the conversation, perhaps, amongst the most important conversations I think happening right now. So that's partly the answer of my personal journey and why it ends here. It started out in public international affairs. I followed my dad, who was a diplomat's footsteps, and was an international criminal lawyer defending war criminals in The Hague and Cambodia, clerked at the Supreme Court of Israel many moons ago, and then came back to Canada, did some intellectual property law. And in each of these cases was sort of trying to either make amends for past sins that the world had committed, think war crimes, and ensure that they weren't committed again, or change how other systems, for instance, how technology systems worked, again, from an intellectual property perspective. And in neither case did I feel that I was creating the impact that I'd hoped. I switched gears, started a software school with a couple of friends who were technical, as opposed to I was on the business side. And that school, Lighthouse Labs, grew to be the largest software boot camp in Canada. And then a couple of years into that experience, found that I was struggling with a couple of my co-founders who remain, thankfully, some of my closest friends, and joined LinkedIn, where I started out in a sales role around online learning, began working with Canada's higher education system really across the country, eventually formed public-private partnerships across North America, including via Microsoft, and running their advocacy or lobbying team. And that's really where I began to focus on what we're talking to you about today, which is how big tech versus the rest advocate around AI. And some of the more specific subjects that I've been working on, from the labor market impacts of AI to how from compute to data the governments would be investing and regulating it.
And Nick, just over to you.
Yeah, no, I also want to echo thanks for having us. And I do think that this topic of public AI, really grateful to be able to talk about it because I think it's really important. The short version of sort of my personal journey is that I guess I started off in undergrad. Actually, I was studying electrical engineering, and I was really fascinated, especially with signal processing broadly. And so I was doing some work with signal processing in a neurology context and in the context of acoustics and kind of processing sound signals. And I was really fascinated by that. But increasingly, I found myself thinking a lot about the social impacts of these technologies, and especially about the social processes by which data is created. And so this sort of led me to want to go back to grad school and do a PhD at the intersection of computing and sort of society. And I was very lucky to find a PhD advisor who would support that. And this got me very fascinated by the idea that so much of AI research, broadly construed, has been reliant on sort of created data. Oftentimes data that's created by volunteers in all sorts of contexts. So you'll hear people talk about things like Wikipedia, blogs, forums, social media. But fundamentally, there was this narrative at the time that I think is still present now, right? That AI and technology and computing and big tech are sort of the outputs of a small set of computer scientists in a room working on a chalkboard or on their laptop, and they just came up with the perfect algorithm, and that algorithm is AI, right? And that's sort of what's enabling power. But empirically, I think that's simply not true. And we're seeing that even more and more as models kind of use bigger and bigger training data sets and, go out and find new ways to get people to create data, is that in fact, like this whole AI, a lot of the value of the computing industry is fundamentally about the collective intelligence of humanity. It's sort of this very, to put it like, maybe to be almost too grand, but I do kind of believe in this. There's this kind of sacred drive of human beings to write stuff down, right? To mark trails and to note, which fruit made you feel sick when you eat it, that sort of extends through our entire collective history. And this is what AI is about. So how does this relate to my personal journey? I guess to be more concrete, I became interested in questions like, what would AI, certain AI system, whether it's ChatGPT or Google, look like without data from Wikipedia? What would a recommender system, like something deployed by YouTube or Netflix or TikTok, what would that look like if some of the users weren't happy about providing data to that anymore, right? What if they were to do a data strike or withhold their data? So I became very fascinated by these counterfactual questions of how would AI systems perform differently if they were missing certain data. And I think that when you start to go down this line of thinking, it really naturally extends to the idea that AI at its core, not just because it's the right thing to do, although I do think that it is, the actual nature of the technology demands that we engage with these sort of public governance questions and demands that we take very seriously this question of like, where do people want their data to go? How do people want their data to be used? And if we don't answer those questions, we just can't really realize the pro-social impacts of AI. And so I think we're on a precipice right now where we can sort of go down this path of AI as a thing that concentrates power broadly and makes the rich get richer. Or we can go down this path where AI is a thing that really is this public good that enhances kind of global access to knowledge and information. And that sort of has led me to a lot of projects nowadays that are sort of in the realm of supporting a public AI, thinking about the data flow that would underlie public AI, thinking about how to empower data creators to kind of engage in dialogue and things of that nature. So, sorry, I said that was the short version, and that is the short version, but I'll stop it there.
Just to explain to people who may not be familiar with what public AI is, both in the Mozilla context, but also in the work that you both are doing, what is your definition of public AI?
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, it's worth noting as well, just I think a really important kind of thing to point out here is that the whole there is no kind of company for public AI or institute for public AI. Public AI, as kind of we, or at least Jake and I, are interested in supporting it, is a thing that is kind of collectively owned by a network right now, right? This is a network of people, academics, nonprofits, people from industry, open source projects, all sorts of institutions and organizations are organizing in a network to promote this idea. And so I want to mention that. And I also want to mention, of course, that there has been an enormous amount of work by people in these networks. So there are various white papers, there are various technical papers, there are various sort of projects that are spinning up. There are projects that are running kind of, these training cycles as we speak right now. Buzz, buzz, buzz goes the computers. And all these things are happening. And these are all collective efforts to the public AI network. So, we are not trying to, in the writing that we're doing and in the various ways that we're contributing to this, it's all part of a network. So I just want to put that out there. Definitionally, we think that it's critical that public AI is about building AI systems that have accountability, like real serious public accountability and real serious public deployment. So there's not one particular vision of what let me put it this way. So one thing that could be public AI, but is not the only thing that we're arguing for, is that a government body actually offers you a service that's just like ChatGPT or Gemini, right? So you can go on your .ca website and sort of use this good, high quality government AI service. That is one version of it, right? And perhaps in an ideal version, the data centers and all of the compute infrastructure that were used to produce that model would have public governance and provisioning, and the actual service itself would have public governance and provisioning. Ideally, the software would be open source, and sort of the whole thing would be transparent and accountable, and you sort of, if you're mad about something, which public body or which representative you can go and complain and say, hey, I don't like that this AI system is doing thing X right now. That seems bad, and you know who that is, right? And that doesn't really exist in private. That being said, that's not the only vision. There's also a vision of public AI, which is really about an ecosystem. So perhaps you have some publicly funded, provisioned, and governed compute, and that's supporting this sort of vibrant ecosystem where you have startups building on top of that. You have partnerships between public bodies and the AI labs. And these things, they're all compatible. So our goal right now is to enable that possibility, not to try to argue for like one specific vision or say, this is what public AI has to look like. So I think, again, there's lots of long white papers. Let me throw it to Jake.
Thank you, because I think that actually was a very helpful and broad beginning with one or two concrete examples. I'm going to try to do the exact same thing, which is give another broad definition that will, I think, overlap with Nick's, but not completely. And in part, that's because what each person and network are bringing to this vision is different. And that diversity is part of the value that the network represents, or that the community, I should say, represents. One network that Nick and I have been working very actively in that overlaps a lot with another organization called MetaGov is called the Public AI Network. So if you just go to publicai.network, you'll see their white paper, and you can join the Slack community that we've been a part of as a result of that. That network, for instance, has been advocating for a specific project around compute, around the processing power necessary to power AI, where countries that are like-minded, values-aligned, progressive, into this idea of public interest, publicly accessible, and publicly accountable technology in general, and AI in particular, that those countries could actually get together and share compute capacity, like Airbus did, building different components of a plane. You could actually have the fact that Mila is really good at allocating compute capacity, and that the Barcelona supercomputer complex and the Japanese, both of which I spent some time with over the past few months, have incredible amounts of capacity or have a particular ability to commercialize via their ties to large Japanese companies, et cetera, et cetera. And you could have this comparative advantage where each of these countries or even sub-regions, private organizations, because it really shouldn't be public in the government sense, but rather in the public-private partnership and public interest sense, that they could all get together and actually create something as powerful in tech, in AI in particular, as the giants, Microsoft, Facebook, Google are, and as in terms of geopolitical power, the US and China are. An alternative, in essence, is what one could define public AI as in the negative sense, to big tech's control over AI and to the dominance of China and the US in AI. So that's the broad example, and one specific one in terms of Airbus for AI. I think when Nick and Mark Sermon, head of the Mozilla Foundation, and I wrote this most recent paper on Canada as a champion for AI, there was 3 areas we zoomed in on to focus in terms of our recommendations for the government of Canada and for folks in Canada more generally. Because again, I think it bears repeating. We call it public AI in part because OpenAI was taken in a way that in most of the community that I've interacted with has bastardized the term open, whether it's nonprofit status, much more publicly, but also the way that ChatGPT has been built is such a closed walled garden that it actually is even more limiting in terms of public access. It has less ability for us to influence democratically or financially how it works than big tech did in the social media and search eras before it. So it's the opposite of that. And the 3 areas we have been recommending to governments, for instance, in Canada to champion are 1, what we talked about before in terms of Airbus for AI and shared compute capacity. 2, and investing in compute that is accessible in the public interest, et cetera. 2, on the data layer, and this is where Nick is really most expert, figuring out how we can build an ethical data commons in Canada. Can we create, and there's some research that we're exploring between SFU and the Dais, the think tank I'm associated with, and others on how data economies work and whether data intermediaries can be leveraged in order to facilitate sharing so that all of a sudden you can get AI built on public data that is unique, so not already in the, on the internet and been scraped by OpenAI, but also has values associated with the jurisdiction, whether that's, we're talking to Parks BC and their work or AI Sweden and their work. That's unique to that jurisdiction, and that is part of this broader public ethos of sharing in the public interest. So data and compute are 2 of them. And then the last one, and this is really Mozilla's focus for a decade and more now, is open source. We believe all of these things should be built as infrastructure, the same way roads and water and trains are. And if that's going to support not just the public sector, but also the private sector, nonprofits and foundations and more, then as much of the code has to be open source, the data has to be open data, and we need to build the communities and supply the tools necessary to steer these technologies in that direction, the same way that Linux so successfully has powered the internet. So those would be the 3 categories that we're really focusing on: compute, open source software, and data in Canada as key factors in public AI.
Talk a little bit about how you imagine governance would work. You sort of talked about the fact that this would be an a more open governance model. Can you give me some sense for what that looks like?
100%. I think this is an idea that has been broken down, needs to be broken down even further into concrete projects, each of which will have their own governance. So for instance, ChatGPT should have its own governance. Claude, I think, and Anthropic have done amongst the most interesting research amongst the major players in generation AI and generative AI, Gen AI, but I feel like we're in generation AI. But folks at Anthropic have worked with folks like the Collective Intelligence Project on some initiatives that I think are really interesting examples of making it accountable, democratically accountable, and the AI that they're building, that is, and specifically that kind of alignment where you ensure that our values are aligned with the values baked into how the technology responds to us. In their cases, coming from things like online polls and offline citizen assemblies that get a large population's views on how the AI should work or even be regulated. And then those views, interestingly, can not only be baked into laws and regulations and policies or influence investments, but they also can be baked into the constitution of how the AI works. So in essence, the AI has its own rules about what it's going to, whether it's going to use profanity or how it's going to talk about sexuality or violence or whatever else. And those rules should come from the population that is using it, in my opinion, and I think in the sort of the opinion of the public AI community. And that kind of democratic tie is sort of particularly interesting in how it can both be baked into human law and code. But that's just one example of how in one set of projects, with Claude by Anthropic being one example, democracy and democratic ideals and accountability are being built in. Nick, did you have any examples?
Yeah, so I'll throw in a couple more examples. I mean, this might sound like it's going to be an aside, but I'll try to make it brief. I think a thing that really excites me about public AI is the potential to kind of actually insert governance levers at every stage in the AI pipeline. And so the stages, I like to kind of think about this about roughly 5-stage model where you start like, why is AI even useful at all? And it starts because like some person somewhere, found something interesting about the world, right? Whether that's like marking down a trail or writing down an interesting fact, right? So somebody found an ancient scroll and read a fact from there and then decided to, put that on the Wikipedia article and say, hey, this famous historical figure, was born in this certain place. So there's like this stage of like recording, making records about the world. And then those records get aggregated into data sets. And those data sets get turned into model weights via the process of compute. So that sort of step right there is like immensely capital gated. And then those models get hooked up to the actual software. So the like inference, quote unquote, inference software, the interfaces that will actually serve them, potentially like routed through all these API pipes and things like that, right? And then ultimately, like a person receives a recommendation or a bundle or an output, it's a poem or a snippet of code or whatever you wanted to get from the AI. And then maybe in the case of AI agents, that output actually is sort of sent out into the world, right? You actually spin up a motor somewhere or you do something real. And so going through that model, right, what's really interesting is that when we take public AI very seriously, you start with the governance based on people are just going to start making choices about what stuff they even want to enter onto the internet, right? Are they even going to enter this scroll that they found, they found a scroll in their basement and they're going to put it on Wikipedia, and they can make that choice about like, where do they actually enter that on the internet? If there is some sort of public data trust that's focused on culture and heritage or things like that, maybe they only put it on there, but they don't put it on the open internet where the Silicon Valley companies can scrape them, right? So you have a governance layer already at like steps 0 or 1, let's call it. Now you can also, because the public AI bodies would be doing the dataset aggregation much more transparently, so maybe looking to one organization, the Allen Institute AI2 down in Seattle, has been doing a really great job of doing open data, being very open and honest about data curation and ablation. So they have a lot of papers where they go into like very specific details about like, here's the exact data from the internet. And so I would imagine that public AI bodies would sort of follow their practices. And so then you could have people actually, whether they're engaging in town halls or citizens assemblies or just like writing to, representatives to make choices about like, hey, we want the data from these kind of websites or these kind of content, or we don't want data from these kind of content, right? So now you can have governance at this stage. On the compute front, if there are public bodies involved in the sort of compute decisions, right? The decision to build a giant data center somewhere, or the decision to use a certain type of energy for the experiments instead of another type of energy, those can leverage all of the existing sort of governance mechanisms that like exist in Canada and elsewhere for making those decisions in the first place, right? And that's a thing that has a long tradition. So we basically can benefit from all of the sort of infrastructure for democracy that exists across the world put together. And then now at the model building stage, you can do stuff like incorporate your constitutional AI or other things like that. And then finally, because it's all open source, you can actually have people directly opting in to use certain interfaces. You can sort of have people forking. I like this kind of open variant that looks kind of like ChatGPT, but it's different. So, sorry, long aside to say that I'm quite excited by this notion that you can actually do this at all the stages. And that's like the vision for public AI that we're advocating for would really be focused on trying to enable all of those kind of up and down the pipeline.
So obviously this is also very closely related to data sovereignty, which is a big topic that we talk about with both across the board, but especially indigenous communities and organizations, where we are also talking about community-owned AI compute and data centers and how that can not only be the right thing from a data sovereignty point of view, but it actually can empower communities from a variety of different angles. But I want to talk about a couple of things that you highlight in your writing. Like, for example, that we have our AI agencies or research ecosystem is one of the world's best. Like our social impact ecosystem is amazing. But we're so fragmented and siloed. So when I talk to, for example, Vector and CFAR run climate and AI, and they're in a self-proclaimed ivory tower that is not collaborating well. How can this be a way to really start building bridges across disciplines, sectors, regions, where we're amplifying what we can do that's rooted in community empowerment and resilience? And what are the obstacles? Because it's not the technology. Even today's technology can do everything that we need to do. Never mind what we can imagine going forward. It's not necessarily in the funding. Yes, the allocation of the funding is the question, but we have potentially the funding. The culture and mindset of that collaboration and knowledge mobilization is really the issue that we had way before AI. So what are the stumbling blocks? What are the obstacles that you see in the work that you're doing?
Difficult question. I want to start with talking about an example of how we can be partnering more closely with Indigenous communities in Canada in a way that there is already some funding going towards projects in Canada, but there's far more, for instance, in New Zealand and other parts of the world. And that is based on small languages. So if the vast majority of the internet, unfortunately, has been sort of shaped by some dominant cultures, English being one of them, it means that the way that we think and write and the way that AI works is limited by those cultures. And that's increasingly the case. So one of my greatest frustrations with increasing adoption of Gen AI is I think it's often bringing people's thinking and writing down to the median, to the average person, which obviously doesn't exist in reality. But that even if you, for instance, don't know how to write as well as the average person, coming out your unique flaws, the flaws in your writing actually are a positive attribute, in my opinion, something that makes it more human, more uniquely us and you. And if one looks at Indigenous languages in Canada, I think there is a massive value, part of which we know is being lost as generations that spoke these languages and lived these languages pass away, where if we can record it and store that data in a manner that, as you put it, is responsible in terms of the original communities keeping sovereignty over it, which could mean everything from being able to monetize it in the future, control access to it, control how it's used, etc. That I think could be immensely valuable, not just for Indigenous communities, but also for them in partnership with Canada and other Canadians, and for Canada and Indigenous communities in partnership with the rest of the world. I think those are exactly the kind of data sets where we have an advantage in our country, because we have been wrestling with a very terrible history with Indigenous populations, but also rectifying that in coming up with new ideas about digital and data sovereignty that can then influence the creation of a more publicly interested and public indigenous minded AI, which I think is one of the key, for Canada at least, values of public AI. And so both relying on those data sets and configuring the relationships between the organizations that are going to be at play in this community. So as an example, for instance, if you look at key Indigenous communities and their leadership in Canada, you look at public organizations, governments, and then the private sector just in Canada, those three groups, I think, have the opportunity with AI to reconfigure their relationship so that power is shared more appropriately. And so that the data, for instance, that is associated with Indigenous languages actually empowers them in a manner that past resources instead will take advantage of. I think I got off a bit on a tangent there. So if you want to bring us back to the core of the question, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that strongly agree with all of that. And so the original question also, I guess, was there was another aspect to this too that I want to make sure to capture it, which is that we already have these institutions. And in fact, right, I think it's really important to call out that, like, if we're trying to argue from public AI from a blank slate, we'd be like, hey, wouldn't it be good if there was a building somewhere and it had like, these computer science professors come in, and it also had some connections to industry, and they had a bunch of nice offices and a bunch of computers, and they got grad students and they did AI research, and they had funding, right? That would be really good if that exists. And of course, yeah, that's what the Canadian AI Institutes do. And really, in many ways, right, they're sort of the Canadian AI Institutes are the prototype for all of this. So, like, very important to acknowledge that. And again, we're not trying to claim the invention of public AI labs at all. And so what I would mention, yeah, these things exist, but what do we need to nudge them towards this path to success, I guess, is the question. And of course, I'm also speaking very much from the junior perspective here. So big caveat there. I actually think that the nudges that we need are small. And so I would say that we have these AI institutes who are putting out research, and generally the practices in machine learning and AI research are quite good when it comes to open sourcing, having transparency, building public goods, right? So these groups are putting out open source code, and there is lots of open data and people are putting up benchmarks. Then you also look at organizations like, so I mentioned AI2, but also so Cohere. Cohere for AI, I think now called Cohere Labs. Fact check me on that. But they have a nonprofit research branch that is doing tons and tons of work to open source code and data and like make technology available, right? And so part of what we need maybe is to just get other organizations to make similar commitments, right? To say like, hey, look at what these orgs are doing. Can we get more people to sort of join the club, right? Can we get a couple more companies to pitch in or to sign on to some sort of open sourcing commitment or some sort of commitment to sort of use and to regenerate a data commons, right? So part of this is also getting money and like sustainable funding for aspects of these. But yeah, I think broadly there is a set of these very small low-hanging fruit asks that are just like, hey, maybe you were thinking about doing some open sourcing anyway from a PR perspective, but can you just do a little bit more? And you could sign on to kind of this public AI letter or mission or set of principles. So there's all this low-hanging fruit to be captured, right? And then I think on the cultural front, that just creating more kind of spaces where people get in the same room, right? And I guess one thing that we would love to do going forward, that we have plans to do, right, is to try to have more convenings at the AI conferences, but also other conferences as well, right? Like get people in the same room and say, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we did some compute pooling? Or, hey, maybe you folks have some model checkpoints that you're just kind of sitting around and collecting dust and you wouldn't mind sharing so that we could take a look or we could learn a little bit more from your experiments, right? And just like, culturally breaking down the kind of like vestiges of the competitive mindset, which is weird, right? You have like in the AI field now in the big like Silicon Valley big labs, which are built on this original foundation of openness, but now are doing like hyper competitive privacy practices, right? Oftentimes using national security arguments, but are, in many ways, like the folks working in these spaces, did their PhDs in computer science somewhere and like posted every single line of code from their dissertation, finished off their PhD, and then went off to the big lab and are now in kind of like lockdown super mode. And I think many of them want to go back to like doing more sharing. And so building a culture around that, I think this is not impossible. I mean, and there is some, there's some positive movement in this space, I think, as more folks are kind of like getting excited about openness, sharing, especially openness around evals. Another thing I'll just point out really quickly, and then I'll wrap up on this point, is that I do think that as AI gets more general, it's really hard actually now not just for a layperson, but for a computer science professor to quickly ascertain whether a certain model is better than another, right? So, I have my little set of benchmarks in my head. But like, now, how many questions when ChatGPT-5 or GPT-5 comes out and Gemini 3 comes out, how long is it going to take me to actually test which one's better? It's going to take me a really long time, right? Like as they get more general, it's harder and harder to know if the quality is good. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go read their technical reports and I'm going to look at some bar charts. And then OpenAI is going to have a version that says, hey, look, our bar chart is better. Google's going to have a version that says, hey, look, our bar chart is better. And then ultimately, I'm just going to say, okay, what's going on here? Mm-hmm. And so I think that what's going to have to happen actually as the market gets more competitive is that companies are going to have to share their evaluation data. And they can't just give you a bar chart anymore. They have to give you a bar chart and say like, hey, here's all the details behind the bar chart. Here's the part that's open. Here's the part that's proprietary. So there's going to be some market pressure to be less proprietary that also can help us to just promote, to sort of like maintain, regenerate this spirit of openness in the field more broadly that I think can be very supportive of public AI.
Do you have a sense for how much like interest and momentum there is around adoption of public AI tools? I'd love to just hear a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of people who are looking to build on it or use it, or what you're seeing there.
Good question. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I guess the quick answer that I'll give there is I think that it's high, or there is a lot of expressed interest that you can, and like the evidence for this, I think is sort of like manifests in terms of like press coverage and statements from both companies and public bodies. We are like going to my previous point about how we're in this weird moment, that we're in this weird window right now where a lot of the recent advances we haven't really fully grappled with them in private or in public, in my opinion, right? So like there's just this core problem that as you create models that are more and more general, the actual amount of like human labor that you need to verify that they did what you want them to do is like, it's rising in a expanding fashion, right? So if I suddenly say, hey, my model does everything now, it does poetry and biology and math. Yeah. Oh, and it can fold your laundry and it can write you a song. You need to go, like someone has to go and actually verify all of those things. Yeah. So this is a big problem because you have models coming out. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, there's models coming out from Google today. Today is a big announcement day. And so it's sort of a nonstop. And so you have all these public bodies who want to adopt or to like build a similar thing, right? And it's really hard to keep up. And so what that means is that when people are putting out these statements and saying like, hey, we want to do more AI, we want to incorporate AI, it's a little bit hard to parse exactly what they mean until we have sort of a settling period. So I think that we're going to have to, like, what I would love to give you is like the empirical answer of, oh yes, here is, sort of 50% of all organizations that meet this criteria have adopted an AI technology that meets this criteria. And I think we just don't have that yet. But I will be watching closely for that. And in the meantime, I think that there is energy for it, and that's important. I don't know. Would you do you have a more specific or less specific version of that, Jake?
I don't know about specific. I mean, I think what I'm finding shocking in terms of Gen AI is the gap between popular usage, particularly in Canada, and less than the biggest companies' adoption. So we have amongst the lowest rates of adoption in the developed world, maybe in the whole world, but certainly in like the OECD kind of thing. And we have extremely high rates of consumers playing around with ChatGPT. And I think the gap in between those two is indicative of a couple different things. One, classic Canadian risk aversion and a lack of investment in R&D and training for our company's employees. But two, the understandable, justifiable fear that if we use these tools as a company, officially, publicly, we're going to be putting ourselves at risk in terms of OpenAI owning all of our data and being able to do whatever we want with it, or the US being able to review all of our data and somehow influencing us via, the responses that ChatGPT is producing, et cetera, et cetera. So that gap, I think, is actually something that Canada should take advantage. Closing that gap, Canada can take advantage of in a couple crucial ways. If we can decrease the risk aversion and increase the adoption in a responsible manner, then that's going to increase our productivity in ways that everybody in Canada's sort of economic sector has been lamenting for a very long time. And it's also going to allow us to take advantage of the unusual awareness, I think, that we have relative to the US, perhaps in a manner more similar to continental Europe, about privacy rights, about human rights and other rights, and how those intersect with the use of the technology that are holding some companies and people back, that we can actually take advantage of that awareness to build a community that adopts AI in a more ethical and responsible manner, that takes advantage of the data that we have and actually opens more of it up, that actually allows more of it to be combined in ways that create an ethical data economy. And that's in part why Nick and others and I are researching these subjects here.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that like trust is such a big factor here, like that we've just kind of, there's a big factor both in terms of the low adoption rates and a big factor in terms of kind of just figuring out like how do you proceed, how do you kind of get blocked because the fact that there is such low trust. And so it strikes me that there is a very big opportunity to build an economy on trust around all this. And so I guess I'm really excited about the idea of how Canada can be a leader in that, because it does seem like such a big shift from what we are seeing. I mean, especially as like AI companies are starting to monetize and insert advertising, that feels like such a move from where we are right now. That feels like it's going to become more urgent.
And just touching upon, first of all, Nick, you mentioned that the nudge that we need may be small, and I think that in a few different areas that may be right. When I shared space with Vector and CFAR around climate and AI for 2 days, they want to do collaboration across sector, across region. When they speak about multidisciplinary, it's often on the research side, but how empowering wouldn't it be to have communities, Arctic communities or northern communities, part of climate monitoring, where you're actually centering data in data sovereignty, but also in ability to do knowledge mobilization around climate monitoring in tundra and permafrost, but it's rooted in community. I think that's something that we won't see that much. Same in terms of disaster response, where decentralized knowledge mobilization is already needed. But I want to talk about something that you both touch upon. Actually, all three of you touched upon, but you definitely do in your writing as well. And that's Canada's ability to lead and responsibility to lead international, because we know that we're small. We can't do this on our own. Jake, you and I have had a conversation about the potential to between the Nordics and Canada to have a strong responsibility. But I also want to highlight, for example, and you mentioned this in your writing as well, is the ability to lead through our diversity. When I talk to Mozilla Foundation in Kenya, that does a lot of amazing digital equity work, we have a diaspora that has real connections worldwide, but we're not utilizing that? Never mind for AI, where development agencies aren't there yet and we don't have those connections, but the potential is there. When you're obviously writing about that, how do we convince, while I understand focus on sovereignty for Arctic security and empowering communities, that's very much becoming a focus now, how do we at the same time realize that we need to lead internationally, and how do we do that in effective ways?
I mean, the first thing I'll call out is the fantastic manifesto written by John Shell of Social Capital Partners recently called A Manifesto for the Resto. I don't love the name, and I think he was open about not loving it either. And a bunch of other folks have called for similar things. Alex Usher within the higher education space, Rob Wright out of the UK, referring to countries other than the US, building everything from munitions plants for Ukraine together to AI, and from healthcare breakthroughs that, for instance, other less democratic countries won't provide research for, all the way through to military and industrial support for each other in the face of less democratic, less liberal, or trade-oriented blocs. So I think that paper is a great frame for this conversation. AI and tech is one area where we need to collaborate, but it's certainly one that is easiest to move fast on, and that speed is going to be crucial here. We already have an incredible community of AI talent in Canada that we can build on. The AI institutes, which sort of are at the forefront of that community, Mila, Vector, and Amy, already have lots of ties to other global centers of excellence in AI, from the ones I mentioned earlier, the Barcelona supercomputer and AI Sweden and others, to the actual research organizations where that work's being done. So we have many of the beginnings of those ties, but our government, as governments in general have tendency to, but I think a conservative federated, federal, provincial, territorial issues being really prominent here, and a government that has lost some of the muscle to build large cooperative relationships across many nations quickly. Our government sort of has the background, but not the current muscles or ability to do that. And so partly what I'm hoping to do is help it, from the private sector, from civil society, and in partnership with companies, build ties more quickly across national boundaries so that we can share data, share compute, share software in ways that allow us to compete with proprietary US and Chinese owned companies. And I think there's a huge interest in that at this moment of national unity, patriotism, pride, whatever that the madness down south has offered us. And if we don't seize on it, it will look even worse than the many attempts over the past 5 or 6 decades, preceding my time on this planet, by Canada to diversify away from America and to build stronger ties to Europe, to East Asia, and to like-minded democratic nations around the world.
I can't remember where I saw this stat, but I think I remember seeing that 70% of our own tech stack is right now dependent on U.S. technology. So, I mean, I think about this in a
That sounds low to me.
yeah, I suspect you're right. But that, I mean, that really just kind of like emphasizes, like, if you're an investor, you want an imbalanced portfolio. You don't want to be sort of too overly invested in one side, and you want to be able to kind of both build your own infrastructure that more is, have a portfolio that's aligned with your values and so on, and then you want to be able to leave when you can. And right now, that's one of the problems, is that the concentration of power, especially as you go down tech stacks, is just sort of so concentrated.
Totally. And even if we abstract from the tech stack, because that is going to be a little specific for the average Canadian to sort of dig into what hardware and software is produced by the Americans or the Canadians, I think at the broader level, part of the issue is, for the longest time we've been evaluating, and I feel bad because Nick is American, so I've got to be a little careful here. But I think that one thing to be clear is we are not discriminating against Americans or America. Rather, it is an administration that has caused huge amounts of problems, a temporary, hopefully, administration that will, in terms of the response to that, I think there is a huge opportunity for us to start measuring things in terms of values and social impact and how our society is going to change. Because part of the problem is, if you just measure our trade relationships and then put effort in based on the size of the total global GDP pie or the potential for Canada, inevitably we're probably under tied to the US, despite 80% of our trade being with the US. But that's not the right measure. Total pot of money is the wrong measure. Rather, what are the implications of these trade relationships, of building this technology together, of using this technology here in Canada? What are the implications of that for our society? Compare that to how much money can you make, and what are the implications of that for our society in the short term and long term, because this might actually make more money in the long term, and then do a much more robust calculation.
Yeah.
I know that we're quickly coming up on time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for any takeaways that you want to leave the audience with. But also, this is a longer conversation, and would love to have almost a mini series on public AI. But anything that, in terms of calls to action for different sectors to get involved, that you are seeing as gaps as we're trying to shape a cohesive government relations strat that is really multidisciplinary, cross-sector, cross-region. Anything that you want to leave as calls to action for nonprofits, philanthropy in general to get involved? How could you build those bridges?
Off the top of my head, adoption is going to be essential. Nonprofits helping nonprofits, and the rest with adoption in Canada, getting over that aversion, fear of sort of using this technology, but then also doing so in a responsible way. And I know Alex, you and Renee, you and I are involved in many different education initiatives, from tech stewardship to one that I'm working on with the Dais and the Human Feedback Foundation called RAISE, funded by Digital, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of different initiatives around the adoption front. I also think government has to begin ensuring that more of its funding ends up in Canadian IP or Canadian talent or companies that have strings attached to the Canadian investments, as opposed to just donations or handouts that require that they stay Canadian and don't, that huge sucking noise of not just talent, but particularly capital down to the US, that doesn't continue. And part of the way to do that is by attaching some of the values judgments that we're recommending, that software be open source, that data have rights provisions around it in terms of compensation, et cetera, digital sovereignty. If you start attaching those conditions to how government spends money on this, the tech startup community, as someone who continues to be a part of it and was formerly quite prominent in it, will rail, you're going to decrease our potential for growth. But they're, again, only comparing this to the kind of growth that happens in Silicon Valley, not the sustainable society that I think we want to build. Nick?
Yeah, would that agree with all that? I think that commitments to open source, I think can go a long way, but obviously can't 100% solve everything, because it also has to be coupled with sort of like investment and having capital in the right places, basically. I would say that for research more broadly, I think that, researchers already have kind of like their incentives are to contribute towards this broadly, right? Like there are incentives to write papers that describe your technology and to share all of your details, including oftentimes your code and your data, so that's reproducible. So in many cases, it's sort of like researchers just keep doing what you're doing. But I do think that sort of like doing more explicit calls for public AI, creating avenues so that like students can work in this space, right? One of the, speaking to the kind of the incentive problems, right, is that right now, oftentimes, if you're a student and you're finishing up your PhD or something, and it feels like, okay, I guess I will just go to Silicon Valley now, because that's sort of the thing to do, right? So like making sure that there's like adequate, other compelling alternatives for students so that they can be part of this. And, that might be fellowships, grants, postdocs, new positions, new institutions. I think obviously all these things come with a big price. So I'm saying them very casually, and they're substantive. Commitments to make, but I think all those could go a really long way. Yeah, and I'll leave it there for now. But there's also just sort of like making sure that we continue to hold, like as I was mentioning before, like having convenings at machine learning conferences that are explicitly about trying to find like-minded people who support this public interest mission. Which, I guess one thing I'll say is that it's most of the community, actually, right? Like I think that almost nobody joins the AI research community or the AI tech community to like build evil AI, right? And like there's a separate discussion to be had about the extent to which sometimes we think that we're doing good, but we need to be checked by other people. But actually, like so many people have this latent desire, I think, to be part of a community around public interest AI, and there exist lots of organizations to make that material, right, to actualize that. But just continuing to make more and make sure that there is like a sustainable space for that, for people to get in the room together and talk about, hey, here's all the strengths that we in this room right now have. Here's how we can apply it towards this public interest AI mission. I think we just got to keep doing that.
Unless there's any other closing thoughts, I want to thank you both, Nick and Nick, for joining us today. We just scratched the surface, and I appreciate you kind of giving it in spoonfuls for the rest of the audience and taking me through kind of your work around public AI as well. That's really appreciated. But would really look forward to deeper dives, especially as the conversation goes on. Renee, any closing thoughts on yours?
No, just really excited to kind of get sort of the conversations around public AI out in the community. And again, especially as a lot of organizations who are grappling with adoption, just like, I think that there would be a lot more excitement if you're thinking about an educator or a nonprofit organization that's really concerned about the ethical implications, and just, the idea that they could, not have to be constantly interrogating whether or not a model is going to be harmful, like, would take a big weight off of your back in terms of trying to decide on adoption. So, I think that that's really exciting. And I do think that there's some very specific public interest challenges that we kind of know about already. And getting specific, I mean, so much of what's going on is like big. So how do we start to actually get small and find some really good like use cases that are interesting? That would be a curiosity for me.
Thank you again, both, and we will end the
Our pleasure.
recording.
My pleasure. I won't speak on your behalf next.
And mine.
Great, guys.